Hello there, interwebs. I hope you're all doing well, and I hope you finally made the leap home because I have an extra special little treat for all of you. As many of you may remember, because I reviewed the pilot episode way back when it premiered earlier last year, I have been watching the show Quantum Leap, the reboot, revival, continuation thing of the original 1980s time-traveling series starring my boy Scotty Batts and queer fashion icon Dean Stockwell playing Al. Let's all just be clear here. We in the queer community, we stan Al. His outfits alone, he's amazing. But anyways, I've been watching the revival version of the show and been very much enjoying it. I have been able to review it week to week just because there's a lot of it and I'm very busy. I'm not like Scotty Batts and have endless amount of time to just leap around and doing all the fancy videos for all of you. I don't know why I'm suddenly getting all like a weird accent going on. But anyways, I've been enjoying it. But I was very lucky this week that the people behind the show, or the more likely the marketing team behind the show, reached out to me to let me know that this week's episode was going to be very specifically about Dr. Ben Song, the time traveler on the show, taking on the Scott Bakula role, leaps into a father of a transgender child in high school, who a transgender woman specifically, who is in women's sports in high school. So very clearly the episode is going to be taking on the current culture war talking point around trans girls in high school women's sports that has become a battleground for a lot of anti-trans bigotry and transphobia that is using that bigotry to attack trans kids and using that to further political goals. So it is very much an episode that is about transphobia and a very big culture war talking point. So I was really excited that the show was being willing to take on a very prescient and important topic on a network TV show. So they reached out to let me know that this episode was happening, and that I also had the chance to be able to talk to the episode's director, who also was the writer on the show and has a small part in the episode as well. So I want to present to you all the interview that I did with the episode's writer and director. I think it was really, really cool. We had a wonderful conversation. Also, before we get to the interview, if you want my further thoughts on this episode as a whole, completely coincidentally, I was actually invited on the wonderful podcast, the Quantum Leap After Show, to talk about this episode. It was really weirdly serendipitous because they had no idea that this was going to be a trans-focused episode, so it led to some really amazing conversations, and they're absolutely wonderful folks over there. So go check out that podcast if you want my further thoughts and dissections of the episode after you check out the interview. The link to their episode should be in the description. So I hope you enjoy the conversation, and we'll talk about the episode afterwards. Well, nice to meet you, and thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Yeah, I saw the episode and really, really loved it. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you about within it was, one of the things I found really unique about it was the fact that it focused on trans supportive parents, which is something that we don't often get to see a lot of in media, especially in like 2012 era. So I wanted to know what your thought was going into choosing to focus on parents who were being supportive of the trans child, and how you thought about writing that.
Yeah, well, I'm growing up. I grew up a trans kid in the 90s, before we had the language for all that. And as I've gotten older, I've tried to kind of understand what my parents were going through. And even if I didn't feel like they were showing up for me in the ways I wanted back then, I look at trans kids today and the ways that their parents are just under legislative assault and attack culturally. And I thought to myself, gosh, it must be really hard to be a parent of a trans kid right now. And so I just wanted to create an episode where we got to get inside what it was like, not only for the trans kid, but also for their family. And I also, of course, wanted to challenge these tropes of isolation and trauma that we get with trans narratives all the time. So it was important for me to start with this family that really loved and supported their trans kid, and then figure out, how to build out from their community to the school and all that stuff.
Yeah, and speaking on that, one of the things that I found really interesting also about the episode was sort of the distinction between, you have another parent and child that are sort of like against the trans kid in sports. And I found it really interesting that the parent was very much like gung-ho, very like turfy in terms of a lot of her sentiment. But the kid was also sort of echoing some of those feelings, but not fully on board, fully being like all the way against in sort of like very transphobic land. And so I wanted to ask you about like the nuance of like instilling transphobia in kids and sort of like the nuances of depicting that and how it can pass on, but also wrestle with
Yeah,
it.
I'm so great that you picked up on that, because I really, that was really important to me to address, is this idea that we pass on our bigotry through our fear and our trauma and our ignorance, to
Mhm.
our children or to the people around us. And even with the character of Margie, who is the most transphobic and trans antagonistic in the episode, I think you get an understanding that there's something else going on that's motivating her fear, and that maybe it has less to do with transness and more to do with protecting her daughter.
Mhm.
And that's why I really just wanted to dismantle where some of that fear could come from, and and kind of lean away from the mustache twirling, pure evil transphobia, and
Mhm.
into the ways that transphobia like seeps in to everyday life, especially for people who don't have experience with trans folks, or don't know trans people and their friends or family. And then in terms of Lucy Loken's character Amanda, I think there are a lot of kids who are struggling to articulate their own belief system, coming from their parents and then the worlds of their school or whatever sort of peer environment they have. And so seeing this young woman move from ambivalence to affirming, I think was
Mhm.
a really important journey, and I hope that it reflects a journey that we can make possible for a lot more people.
Yeah. No, I agree. Like a lot of the times that I see transphobia coming from, it's usually from this like protect the kids, protect my child sort of feeling, and very misplaced, obviously, but that's generally where it comes from. So I thought that was
Yeah,
really awesome.
yeah,
Um, I also, you said you grew up a trans kid in the 90s, and so I was curious to see your thoughts on sort of the fact that this episode took place in 2012 and what you sort of wanted to do to really depict that era. Because
yeah,
right now, obviously, talking about trans kids in sports, that's very much become a huge culture war issue being stoked by transphobic ghouls. Uh, just to
yes.
put it very clear. Um, so there's a difference in terms of the talking points and the rhetoric between 2012 and today, but obviously there's a huge correlation, similar ideas.
Yeah.
So I was curious your thinking about the distinctions in the time period.
Well, I really wanted to lay it out for people that this has been going on a long time.
Hmm.
That trans youth have been here a long time, and they've been fighting for participation a long time and protection a long time. And also, you know, I think there's a certain irony, Quantum Leap is about rewriting the past to make a different present or a different
Hmm.
future. And so by going back to 2012, which was like when Jazz Jennings was trying to play basketball,
Yeah.
to say like, well, if we can in our minds collectively agree that we should have gotten this right 11 years ago, maybe we can move forward in a better way now.
Yeah. Awesome. Um, so another thing that I wanted to touch upon was also how, and this is something that I don't have the language to necessarily discuss, but I was curious like how race played into the discussions in the episode. I mean, clearly this is a trans woman of color. Dr. Ben
Mhm.
Song himself is an Asian man. And
Yep.
so, and there's at one point in the episode where he even tries to connect with her as well. And sort of gets some pushback as well. So I was curious how you sort of thought about like who the characters are, their race, their
Yeah.
to their heritage. Wanted to see how that played into it.
Yeah. It really important to me that the character of Gia was trans Latina. And
Mhm.
that's because she is based off of my dear friend Gia, who was trans Latina and who took her own life
Mhm.
many years ago.
Sorry.
Also, the character is inspired by Anthony Colleen, who was another queer Latinx activist who, back in the 90s, when I was a kid, was also in the school district next to me
Mhm.
fighting for change. And ultimately, they ended up taking their own life too, years later when they were working as Lady Justice. So my experience was like what Ian's experience is in the episode of like, there was a trans kid over here and we were both fighting to exist, and I made it and she didn't,
Mhm.
and I have to live with that. And so that's what I brought into the episode in this way, that I really wanted to uplift the nuances and particularities of a trans Latina experience. And I'm not trans Latina, but working with my friends who are in the community, um, and other writers in the room who are from Latin experience, like I felt like I could bring the truth of what I knew from Gia and Tony's life to the character of Gia. And you know, we talk about representation mattering like so much, and within the trans umbrella and even the trans woman of color umbrella, there's a particular intersection of bigotry that that trans Latina people face, or trans Latino or trans Latinx or trans Chicana, whatever you want to say, you know, because in our country right now, there is a certain amount of like anti-Latino, Latina sentiment and anti-trans sentiment. And in that particular Venn diagram where trans Latinx people live, they are subjected to an intersection of oppression and harassment. And I think that's, you know, portrayed really clearly in the episode.
Yeah, no, I thought so too. But again, speaking from my background where that's not that. So
Yeah.
clearly I'm sure there's more nuanced critiques than I could bring, but I wanted to make sure it was discussed.
Yeah.
Also too, I mean, you mentioned, you know, people who have died by suicide, which, you know, as someone who's also in the trans community and has experienced both myself and seen other people deal with. And I wanted to say thank you for the really wonderful section, played wonderfully also by Mason, where they talk about that. And I wanted to know your thoughts about writing that and depicting that. And I thought it was really very well done. And I just want to say thank you and ask your thoughts about it.
Yeah, I mean, it was a hard thing to write. It was hard for Mason to perform. It was one of those moments on set where everyone was just still and quiet and taking the space to let it happen. So grateful to our visual effects team for creating that graphic that shows the difference between the risks that you know, homeless cisgender youth face versus homeless trans youth, because I think that really helps underscore what's at stake for these kids. But ultimately, you know, I have lost too many people to suicide in my life, and all of my trans friends can say the same thing. And we want to honor the generation of trans artists and scholars and athletes that the world will never get to know, and also make the world safer for this younger generation of trans artists and scholars and athletes so that they can live full and creative and productive and hopeful lives. And so sometimes we have to venture into our own pain to create and bring forward hope for someone else. And I think that's what that scene does.
Yeah, no, I definitely felt that. I think you did a great job with it, and Mason did a great job as well.
Thank you.
Speaking of like me relating to that scene, on a more positive note, one of the scenes that I did really like in the episode was you had Trace come in and play a trans character that could talk about like an older trans experience. And I really loved, especially on like a big TV show like this, you get to see two trans characters relating to each other, which you so rarely see in a lot of media. You have like the one trans character who has to stand for the entire community. And also has to be like a perfect like person and a perfect human being too. So I was curious to see how you went about like wanting to talk about like trans characters relating to each other, and then also different generations of trans characters as well.
Yeah, well, one of the, you know, two things that I really wanted to challenge with the episode were these tropes of trauma and singularity, as I mentioned before. And so it was really important to me to show the character of Gia in a community of transness, whether that was with her peers at the support group or with her mentor, Trace. And Trace Lissette, you know, she's an icon and a dream. And I knew that she was the one to do this also because she's a b-baller and she like knows what she's doing.
I didn't know that actually.
Yeah, she made all those shots.
Oh, great.
But also this idea of like intergenerational trans relationship is so important because we don't have the infrastructure of societal support. We don't have a sense of our legacy and our generational continuity. And so, you know, I've been the irate young trans activist, you know, vehemently critiquing my elders, and I've been torn down by the young. Like, I get it. You know, we're all angry and fighting for a place at the table and visibility and our voices to be heard. But what the world needs to know and what we deserve to know is that we have our history, and our history is mostly up to this point oral tradition, but that translates into storytelling and that translates into television. And when we have the opportunity to do that, we get to let the world in to what our connections are and what our roots are. And that was really important for me to be able to do in this episode.
Oh yeah, no, I definitely agree. It was awesome. going so to kind of focus really on the topic of the episode, which is trans kids in high school sports, like obviously, as I said before, like been made a huge culture war issue, and it's usually done under the veneer of like we're thinking about fairness, we're thinking about the young girls. And I love the point that you brought up, which is something that so often gets ignored, is that a trans girl deserves to also be able to play and get to take part and get to be protected as well. And in so much of the right wing and very awful talking points in the cultural narrative, that gets forgotten. It's all about protecting the cisgender kids.
Yeah.
And we forget that there are trans kids at stake here too. So I wanted to talk to you about depicting that, and how you thought about really going after this issue that has become such a big talking point.
Yeah, well, like I said, I wanted to try and avoid the TED talk of it and just
Mm-hmm.
get into the heart of it. And when you like meet Gia and you see what her family's going through, you're just like, let the girl play basketball. You know what I mean? And I think that's what happens, and what the monologue I wrote in the support group is about, is that, politically, certain fear mongers on the right have created this boogeyman of
Mm-hmm.
trans kids that are like rapists and murderers and or something so terrible. And really, you know, it's an excuse to create laws to restrict women's bodies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, you know
Yeah.
what I mean? Trans people is a step towards.
It's all
Yeah,
part of the same system that's using
it's
to interconnect racism, homophobia,
yeah,
sexism. Yep.
exactly. It's so you know, I didn't want to spend the episode trying to tease out those isms and explain that, that sort of variation on the theory. I was like, let's use the episode to just break down the bias and open up the hearts.
Mm.
And that's what I really wanted to do, because also it takes nuance. You're not going to have, even though the episode is called Let Them Play, and the message is like trans kids deserve the right to, be included and all that stuff. Every school is going to have their own situation. There's going to be nuance. There's going to be belief systems and parents and protocols that are going to have to be revised and revisited with a kind of goal to forge a common understanding. And
Mm.
so, we try to show what that might look like in this episode, in the hopes that communities will start to take that upon themselves and stop listening to fear mongering politicians and start thinking about their kids.
Yeah, no, I very much agree. Um, so nearing the end actually of my list of questions here, but one more that I wanted to ask you, and actually I have two more, sorry. One more that I wanted to ask you though was about support and community support. And again, I really love the moment at the end where you have Gia playing basketball, and there are the really transphobic people in the crowd who've been stoked up by the culture war stuff that goes on within the episode and the bullying. But then you have Ben redirect her to say, like, look at all these people who are here to support you, and there are more of them.
Yeah.
Which is, often, I think sometimes depends on where you live for sure. But I think that also does happen too. And focusing on the people who are there to be your family and be there to support you, I think was a really cool moment. So I just wanted to see how you thought about depicting that and sort of that moment in the episode.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I want every trans kid who's in Gia's position to be able to stop, take a breath, and remember that there are more people for them than against them.
Mm-hmm.
Because that can be enough to, that knowledge, that like knowing that in your heart that more people have your back than don't, could prevent a lot of trans kids from making poor choices around self-harm or dropping out of school or running away. I mean, you just have to believe that people care about you and honor your right to exist. And so that's the biggest message that I'm just trying to like Care Bear stare out to the trans kids.
Yeah, 100%. So one more I have too, and actually I just sort of remember this one, but it was a really great moment where you have blanking on the character's name, so apologies,
Mhm.
but the character who was in the military,
Yeah.
having dealt with the trans military ban, which was under Trump,
Mhm.
and how she said nothing when
Yeah.
other people in the military, trans people in the military, were getting kicked out, and sort of just becoming an accomplice by being silent. And so I was just wanted to pass it to you, just sort of how you were thinking about depicting that scene and having that conversation.
Yeah, it's so great. Caitlin Bassett, who plays the character of Addison,
Addison.
she's a real life veteran,
Mhm.
and she was really clear with the writers, like she didn't want to be a picture perfect character. She wanted to have flaws. She wanted to have a backstory that was complicated. And so when I brought up the idea, like, hey, what if you didn't, what if you didn't do anything to stop the trans ban? It was it was a real like call in to invite Caitlin, the actor, to bring her own experience of being in the military to Addison, the character, and then share this idea that like even within that industrial complex, there were people who could have made a difference who maybe didn't. And being able to own up to that is so important because we fail all the time as allies and accomplices. We fail all the time, but only by saying, man, I didn't show up in the right way this time. I want to show up better next time. Only by just having that blatant confession do you get to move forward in your active allyship. And so seeing someone go through that and being able to identify with that in the show, I think will help people make that own realization, within themselves.
Awesome. Well, it looks like I'm basically out of time, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time and thank you so much
For
for this
sure,
episode.
Jesse. It was so great chatting with you.
It was great chatting with you. It's a big nerd. I was very, very, very pleased and excited about this episode, so I really appreciate it.
Awesome. That's so cool.
Cool. That's great meeting.
All right. Take care. Yeah, likewise.